The last whispers of daylight hung over Millstone, a town where every corner seemed familiar. It was the kind of place where neighbors exchanged pleasantries over white picket fences, where everyone knew each other's names and stories. But the warmth of the small town was about to be shattered in the most chilling way. In the blink of an eye, Olivia Martin, a woman with no enemies, no secrets, vanished without a trace. A mother, a teacher, a friend. The quiet streets would soon be drowned in the sound of confusion and terror. Millstone had always been quiet. You could count on one hand the number of crime reports in the past decade. That night, as the amber glow of streetlights cast long shadows down Main Street, Olivia Martin walked out of the local bar, her voice trailing off in laughter with a few close friends. It was nothing unusual. After all, Olivia was known for being the life of any party. But as she stepped onto the street and made her way home, she disappeared into the night as if the world had swallowed her whole. Her disappearance was met with the same concern that would grip any small town when tragedy strikes. But soon, it became clear that this was no simple case of a woman returning home after a night out. The hours turned into days, and with each passing moment, the anxiety of her family and friends grew. The police started their routine search. It began with interviews, a neighborhood canvass, and the usual checks. Her car was still in the driveway, her phone left behind. No signs of struggle, no evidence of foul play. The worst part? There was nothing. The town's sense of safety had been shattered, but there was no clear reason why. Days went by, and as the authorities searched high and low, something strange started to surface. Friends of Olivia, the people who knew her best, began to recall little details they hadn't thought twice about before. Caroline, Olivia's childhood friend, recalled that she had received a cryptic voicemail from Olivia the evening she disappeared. The message was jumbled, fragmented. At first, it seemed like nothing more than a drunken ramble. But then, Caroline played it back again. "They're watching me, don't. I'll be fine, just..." The voicemail ended abruptly. Olivia never answered when Caroline called back. That was the last anyone heard from her. That voicemail made the hairs on the back of Caroline's neck stand up, but when she mentioned it to the police, they dismissed it as just another bit of confused rambling. After all, Olivia had been known to drink, and the phone call wasn't a concrete lead. But something about it gnawed at Caroline. The more they dug, the more unsettling it became. Olivia's car, though parked in the driveway, was slightly off-center, as if someone had driven it there but hadn't taken the time to properly park. Could she have been forced into the car by someone? It seemed unlikely, but the odd detail remained. And then there was the matter of the new neighbor, Daniel Carter. He had recently moved into the house down the street from Olivia. He kept to himself, didn't seem to have many visitors, and yet, he was always around when people asked after Olivia. He had been among the first to join the search parties, and everyone spoke well of him. But there was something off about him, something not quite right. People mentioned that his gaze seemed to linger a little too long when he passed by Olivia's house. Caroline had noticed it too, the way Daniel looked at her. But she didn't think much of it. Still, there was a gnawing feeling in her gut, one that told her to trust her instincts. Was it paranoia or just a natural reaction to the confusion? As the investigation wore on, Olivia's family began to lose hope. After all, the police were handling it, they had their leads, their team. But as the days turned into weeks, things began to feel wrong. Millstone wasn't supposed to be a town like this. Olivia Martin wasn't supposed to vanish. There were no signs of a struggle, no ransom demands, no witness statements that offered even a glimmer of clarity. It was as if she had simply vanished into thin air. And then, something even more chilling happened. Detective Sarah Walsh, a veteran investigator, was called in. She reviewed the case files and began retracing the steps Olivia had taken that night. The usual leads turned up nothing. But there was one part of the investigation that didn't sit well with her, the voicemail. Detective Walsh asked herself, what would make Olivia leave in such a state? And why, if she was just drunk, would she mention "they're watching me"? She dug into Olivia's life, speaking to her friends, her family, her co-workers. All described her as the kind of person who would never let anything, or anyone, intimidate her. But one person, Olivia's boss at the school, shared a new bit of information. A month before her disappearance, Olivia had been investigating a troubling pattern among her students. One of her brightest pupils had gone missing as well, with no explanation. Olivia had been privately looking into it, trying to connect the dots, but no one knew exactly what she had found. The investigation had been brushed under the rug by the school, and Olivia had never shared the findings with anyone. Did Olivia know something she wasn't supposed to? What was she really looking into? Stay tuned to uncover the shocking secrets behind Olivia's disappearance. Don't forget to subscribe and share your theories in the comments below. Months had passed since Olivia Martin's disappearance, and the town of Millstone had begun to settle into an uneasy silence. People whispered behind closed doors, but no one seemed to know anything for sure. That is, until one day, the unthinkable happened. Another body was found in the woods just outside of town, and this time, everything was about to change. For what they discovered was more than just another random death. It was a link that no one saw coming. It wasn't long before the case began to grow cold. The police had exhausted all their leads, and the community was beginning to accept the unsettling reality that Olivia might never return. Her family clung to fragile hope, still convinced that she had simply left, that something had caused her to disappear of her own accord. Detective Sarah Walsh, however, had never quite bought that theory. She had a hunch. Her instincts were sharper than most, and she knew the truth was still buried somewhere beneath the surface. Then came the break. The body of Nathaniel Parker, a local man in his mid-30s, was discovered deep in the woods one cold morning. The find was unsettling. He was found barely a mile from Olivia's home, his body cold and stiff, hidden among the dense thicket. It was a scene that bore haunting similarities to Olivia's case. No signs of violence, no obvious injuries, just a lifeless body in the woods, as though he had simply collapsed. No one had heard anything, and no one had seen anything. For a brief moment, the investigation felt as though it might be another unfortunate, unsolved death. But then the similarities became undeniable. Nathaniel had been a quiet man, a regular at the same coffee shop Olivia frequented. Though they never exchanged more than pleasantries, both had been drawn into the same orbit, a series of seemingly small interactions that connected their lives without anyone realizing it. The initial reports on Nathaniel's death were not much different than Olivia's. There was no sign of struggle, no robbery, no trace of forced entry or violent attack. In fact, the cause of death was so unclear that investigators struggled to determine the immediate cause. His body had been found far from any roads or paths, an isolated location not typically visited by locals. Yet, there he was, lying hidden in the woods. Detective Walsh decided to investigate the connections between the two victims, thinking that their mutual association with the coffee shop might offer some insight. When she spoke to the shop owner, Marissa, she learned something unexpected. Nathaniel had often sat in the corner booth of the coffee shop, alone, his eyes scanning the door like he was waiting for someone. Olivia, on the other hand, had always been friendly with the staff, a regular customer known for her bubbly personality. But recently, she had become more withdrawn, visiting less frequently and sitting by herself in the corner, lost in thought. This odd behavior was also noticed by several of Olivia's close friends. Caroline, who had been trying to reach Olivia the night of her disappearance, now recalled a phone conversation where Olivia had seemed on edge. "It's not safe here," Olivia had told her, a cryptic statement that Caroline hadn't thought much of at the time. Could it be that Olivia had known something about Nathaniel's death, or that she had stumbled upon something connected to him? Walsh's next move was to review the surveillance footage from the coffee shop's security cameras. There, she found something chilling. The footage showed Olivia walking into the shop one afternoon, looking for a quiet corner to read. She had been distracted by something, or someone, at the door. Just as she turned to sit, a shadow loomed behind her. A man, tall and broad-shouldered, with a hurried and uncomfortable energy about him, walked past Olivia and took a seat at a table nearby. The strange part? The man had been sitting there for nearly an hour before Olivia noticed him, her back to him the entire time. As she looked up, the man was watching her intently. His stare was unblinking, almost predatory. Olivia seemed uncomfortable, but she didn't make a scene. The man in the footage was identified as Daniel Carter, the new neighbor who had moved into the house just down the street from Olivia. Sarah Walsh hadn't thought much of him until now. He had been among the first to join the search parties and offered his help when Olivia's friends and family reached out. But now, looking back, it felt like too much of a coincidence. The surveillance footage was just the beginning. Further investigation into Carter's background revealed a history that was both ordinary and unsettling. He had been involved in a string of odd, isolated incidents before moving to Millstone. There were records of complaints about disturbing behavior, nothing violent, but strange interactions with women in the past, allegations of stalking in his previous town, and a pattern of unexplained absences from work. However, nothing concrete. No charges, no proof that he had been involved in anything criminal. Yet, his presence at the coffee shop during the final moments of Olivia's life, combined with the eerie similarities between his disappearance and Nathaniel's, made it clear that Walsh needed to dig deeper. With her suspicion now focused squarely on Daniel Carter, Detective Walsh revisited the timeline of both deaths. Olivia's final few hours had been disturbingly close to Nathaniel's last known whereabouts. Both had disappeared without warning. And both, Walsh suspected, had become too close to something they couldn't escape. The pressure began mounting on Walsh. She pushed harder, gathering statements from Olivia's friends, family, and acquaintances. Something was off about the way people talked about Daniel. No one had seen him on the night of Olivia's disappearance. His alibi was weak. In fact, he seemed to have been conveniently absent at the time of her vanishing. Do you think Daniel Carter is guilty of these deaths, or is there something more sinister at play? As Walsh uncovers more, the truth becomes harder to swallow. Make sure to subscribe and join us to see how deep the rabbit hole goes. Could this be the work of someone far more dangerous than anyone realized? Detective Sarah Walsh had always trusted her instincts. But the deeper she dug, the more she began to question them. She had been so sure that Daniel Carter was the key to solving Olivia's disappearance, but now, there was doubt that perhaps she had been looking in the wrong direction the whole time. A breakthrough was coming, but it wasn't going to be the one she expected. Detective Walsh stood in front of Daniel Carter's house one chilly morning, staring at the modest, two-story building. From the outside, it looked like any other home in Millstone. But she had learned to never trust appearances. Her gut told her that Daniel held the answers to Olivia's disappearance. His aloofness, his odd behavior, the fact that he seemed to be everywhere when he shouldn't be, he had become the prime suspect in her investigation. But something didn't add up. It had been weeks since Daniel was first brought into the fold, and despite his suspicious presence at Olivia's coffee shop and his strange alibi, there was still no concrete evidence that directly tied him to her disappearance. His behavior was disturbing, but it wasn't criminal. He hadn't left any physical trace, no DNA, no fingerprints, no eyewitnesses placing him at the crime scene. He was clever, perhaps too clever. There was a chilling pattern to his evasion, a calculated, almost methodical approach to avoiding suspicion. Walsh's next step was to dig deeper into Daniel's history. She accessed his records, spoke with people from his past, and followed a trail of inconsistencies that began to unravel his life. Daniel had moved to Millstone about 6 months ago, ostensibly to escape a troubled past. He had arrived with no friends, no family nearby, and only a vague explanation about wanting a fresh start. His background, however, was far from clean. In his previous town, Daniel had been involved in a string of disturbing incidents. He had been known to frequent places that catered to individuals with more obscure, deviant interests, places that specialized in psychological manipulation, gaslighting, and control tactics. There were no criminal charges, but whispers followed him wherever he went. A former colleague at his previous job spoke about how Daniel was always on edge, never fully integrated into the team, and often seemed overly interested in people's personal lives. He had a way of making people uncomfortable without them fully understanding why. And then there was the most chilling piece of information Walsh uncovered. Daniel had been involved in several missing persons cases in the past. People he had met, people who were new to town, had vanished under strange circumstances. But each time, there was never enough to charge him with anything. Like clockwork, he had been present, offering help, suggesting solutions, even helping organize search efforts. He always seemed to be in the right place at the right time. Too perfect. Too clean. But Walsh wasn't convinced yet. There was something even darker lurking beneath Daniel's surface, something more than just a string of weird coincidences. When she spoke to the librarian, Clara Hayes, she learned something that sent a shiver down her spine. Clara had known Daniel from his brief visits to the library. He had asked her about the works of crime writers and psychological thrillers. At first, she thought little of it. Many people enjoyed crime novels. But one day, Daniel had requested a book that focused specifically on the psychology of power and control. The title, The Art of Manipulation, was enough to make Clara pause. She mentioned that Daniel had been acting particularly peculiar the last few weeks. On a recent visit, he had checked out books about human behavior, about how to understand people's deepest fears and desires. He wasn't looking for general knowledge. He was looking for something specific, something that hinted at a darker purpose. Clara said Daniel had asked strange questions about how people respond to fear, how they react under pressure. He had a specific interest in victims, asking in a manner that sent chills down her spine. His questions were always too pointed, too curious about the human psyche. Walsh began to see a pattern emerging. Daniel wasn't just a man with an unusual personality. He had been studying his victims in plain sight, choosing them carefully. Olivia, Nathaniel, and others who had gone missing. They were all linked by one common thread. He had taken a keen interest in them before they disappeared. Walsh's investigation now turned into something more than just a missing persons case. She was piecing together a horrifying possibility. Daniel wasn't just a bystander in these people's lives. He had orchestrated their disappearances, using his knowledge of human behavior and manipulation. He had been playing the role of the concerned neighbor, the helpful stranger, the friendly coffee shop regular. He had embedded himself into their lives, gaining trust before he took everything from them. The breakthrough came when Walsh re-examined Olivia's last few interactions with her friends. Caroline, one of Olivia's closest friends, mentioned that Olivia had seemed more on edge than usual in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. Olivia had mentioned a shadow in her life, someone who had been watching her. But Olivia never named the person, never went into details. She had brushed it off, as if it was just a passing paranoia. Now, Walsh realized that Olivia had known she was being watched, and that it was Daniel who had been lurking in the background, manipulating the situation without anyone noticing. Returning to the coffee shop, Walsh retraced the steps of Olivia's last few visits. The shop owner, Marissa, remembered Daniel distinctly. He was always there at odd times, sometimes sitting at the back, sometimes hovering near the counter. Marissa had noticed the way Daniel seemed to gravitate towards Olivia, as though there was an unspoken connection. But nothing ever seemed to happen. Nothing was overt. Daniel was careful, too careful. Walsh couldn't shake the feeling that Daniel had been orchestrating everything from the shadows. She felt as if she were playing a game of chess, and Daniel was always one step ahead. Every move, every gesture, every word he said had been calculated. But Walsh was beginning to understand his game. Could Daniel Carter be the mastermind behind all of this? Or is there something even darker at play here? Walsh is getting closer to the truth, but is she ready for what she might find? Stay tuned, this case is about to take a turn no one saw coming. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button, and let us know your thoughts on what's happening in the comments below. The deeper Detective Sarah Walsh dug into Daniel Carter's life, the more she uncovered an intricate web of lies, deceit, and manipulation that spanned far longer than anyone could have imagined. But as the final pieces clicked into place, Walsh was forced to confront a terrifying truth. Daniel Carter wasn't just hiding a past, he had been carefully crafting his future, and everyone around him had been nothing more than pawns in his twisted game. It had been months since Olivia Martin had vanished without a trace. What was once a quiet, hopeful investigation had now escalated into something more sinister, something Walsh couldn't ignore. She had felt for some time that Daniel Carter was more than just a suspicious neighbor. But now, as the investigation grew more complex, Walsh began to understand the full extent of his manipulations. Detective Walsh's focus had shifted entirely to Daniel Carter. She knew that if she could just connect the dots, she could expose him for the manipulative predator he was. But every piece she uncovered only made the case murkier. There were no signs of violent crime, no clear evidence of a physical altercation with any of the victims. Nothing that would definitively connect him to the murders or disappearances. It was like he was too perfect, too well constructed. He had left no fingerprints, no DNA, and no physical evidence to tie him to any of his victims. But then, Walsh found something unexpected. Walsh returned to the coffee shop once again, this time asking Marissa, the owner, to retrieve more security footage. Marissa had been hesitant, unsure whether there was anything else of importance. But Walsh's insistence paid off. The new footage revealed a critical moment, one that would shatter the carefully constructed image of Daniel Carter as a harmless neighbor. In a particularly grainy clip, Daniel could be seen leaving the coffee shop on the night Olivia disappeared. He was in a hurry, looking over his shoulder repeatedly, as though making sure no one saw him. But what struck Walsh was the unmistakable expression on his face, a look of satisfaction, like someone who had just pulled off a successful plan. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. Daniel Carter wasn't just a friendly neighbor. He was playing a part, and that part was getting dangerously close to being exposed. Walsh, now more convinced than ever, pushed forward with her investigation. She turned her attention to Daniel's past, speaking to people who had crossed his path before Millstone. What she found was deeply disturbing. Daniel had always been a master of manipulation. He had been a loner throughout his life, using charm and subtle psychological tactics to keep others at arm's length. But behind that charm was a far darker truth. In his previous town, Daniel had been involved in a number of disturbing incidents. They were not violent in the conventional sense, but the impact was undeniable. He had been known to follow people, plant false ideas, and create confusion in their lives. There were reports of him befriending vulnerable women, gaining their trust, and then using their fears and insecurities against them. He had a penchant for studying his victims, carefully learning their weaknesses before exploiting them. But in Millstone, his manipulations had escalated. He had targeted Olivia, Nathaniel, and even a few others who had come into his life, carefully orchestrating their disappearances one by one. But what Walsh didn't expect was the full extent of Daniel's manipulation. He hadn't just targeted random victims, he had been meticulously setting up his future all along. It was as if he was building a narrative, a life where he could control every aspect, every person. Daniel was playing a game of psychological chess, and Walsh had only just begun to see the scale of his twisted ambition. As Walsh began piecing together Daniel's pattern of behavior, she realized that Olivia had known something. Before her disappearance, Olivia had been investigating an unexplained trend in her students. Several of them had been acting out, showing signs of psychological distress that couldn't be attributed to normal adolescent struggles. Olivia had been trying to find the cause, connecting the dots between students who were silently suffering. Walsh connected the dots. Olivia had been getting too close to uncovering Daniel's true nature. She had begun to understand the manipulation and gaslighting that had been happening in Millstone. When she got too close, Daniel saw her as a threat. She had to be silenced before she could expose him. And so, Daniel orchestrated her disappearance, making it appear as though Olivia had simply run away, when in fact, she had been carefully eliminated. Nathaniel's death, Walsh now realized, was no accident either. Nathaniel had been involved with Daniel in some way, but he had begun to pull away after he realized what Daniel was doing. He had gotten too close to the truth. Daniel had silenced him too, using the same subtle tactics, manipulating Nathaniel into a position where his death would be written off as an unfortunate, unexplained tragedy. Just when Walsh thought she had everything figured out, a twist came that changed everything. While examining Daniel's finances, Walsh found a disturbing revelation. Daniel had been siphoning money from a number of local businesses, operating under the radar. He had established a small but significant criminal enterprise in Millstone. It wasn't just about manipulation for pleasure or control, it was about control over the town itself. Daniel had been using his charm and psychological influence to weave a net of influence across Millstone, slowly gaining power and control. The disappearances weren't just personal, they were part of a larger plan to establish dominance over the town, to create an environment where he could thrive without anyone ever suspecting his true intentions. Walsh was no longer working against just a man suspected of multiple disappearances. She was now confronting a master manipulator who had carefully crafted a network of control. She knew she was running out of time to confront him. Daniel had been slipping through the cracks for years, and every lead she uncovered felt like it only led to more questions. The walls were closing in. Walsh knew that the only way to end this was to confront Daniel directly. Detective Walsh is closer than ever to unraveling the full truth behind Daniel Carter's manipulations. But the deeper she goes, the more dangerous it becomes. Will she finally catch him, or will he slip away once again? Subscribe now to find out how the web of lies and manipulation is about to come crashing down. What will Walsh uncover in the next? Don't miss it. As the clock ticked down, Detective Sarah Walsh stood face to face with the man she had been hunting for months. But the deeper she dug into Daniel Carter's life, the more she realized just how carefully he had constructed the lie he had been living. It wasn't just a case of a man disappearing into the shadows, it was a case of a man who had orchestrated everything, controlling every piece, manipulating every person. And now, as the final confrontation loomed, Walsh had to ask herself, was she truly ready to uncover the depths of his darkness? Detective Walsh had never been more sure of herself, nor more terrified. After months of investigation, dead ends, and endless questions, the time had finally come. She had tracked Daniel Carter through every twist and turn of his lies, but now, standing outside his house, the reality of the situation felt more suffocating than ever. The man she had believed was just an unassuming neighbor was, in fact, a master manipulator, someone who had carefully orchestrated the disappearances of Olivia, Nathaniel, and others, all while maintaining the perfect image of a helpful, friendly figure. The web of deception had extended far beyond what anyone could have imagined. And now, as she prepared to confront him, Walsh understood the gravity of the situation. This wasn't just a murder investigation. This was a case of a man who had controlled an entire town without anyone knowing. Walsh approached Daniel's house cautiously. She had a team in place, waiting for her signal to move in, but she knew this confrontation would likely unfold as a high-stakes, one-on-one showdown. When she knocked on the door, the last thing she expected was the calm, collected response she received. Detective Walsh. I've been expecting you, Daniel said, his voice smooth and unfazed, as though he had been waiting for this moment for a long time. His calmness struck her like a slap in the face. How could he be so composed? Did he know she was closing in, or was this part of the persona he had so carefully crafted? Walsh stepped inside, her hand subtly resting on the holster beneath her jacket. She had no idea how this would end, but she wasn't about to back down now. The tension was palpable, a suffocating silence that hung between them like a weight. Daniel's eyes locked onto hers with unnerving intensity. Why did you do it? Walsh asked, her voice steady but laced with the fury of months spent chasing shadows. Daniel smiled slightly, the corners of his mouth curling into a look of amusement, as if the truth was something too simple for her to grasp. It was never about doing it. It was about control, detective. About watching and understanding. About making the pieces fit in the way I wanted. As the conversation continued, Daniel began to unravel the truth behind his manipulations. He had not acted out of some petty desire for revenge or crime. It was deeper than that. The twisted satisfaction he had derived from the disappearances, the murders, was not about bloodshed, it was about the psychological thrill of bending others to his will. Every person he had targeted had been a puzzle piece in his grand plan, and Olivia's investigation had been the final straw. I watched her, you know, Daniel said casually, as if he were talking about a hobby. Olivia was close. She knew too much. But she wasn't the only one. Nathaniel was the same. They were all close to uncovering the truth. The truth about how easy it is to control people when you understand them. When you understand their fears, their weaknesses, and their desires. Walsh clenched her fists. Every word Daniel spoke felt like a hammer hitting her mind. He wasn't a killer in the traditional sense. He was a puppet master, pulling the strings of people's lives without anyone realizing it. The moment they became a threat to me, I just removed them, Daniel continued. I never had to hurt anyone directly. I just pushed the right buttons, set the right scenarios in motion. You should have seen it, Detective. Watching them unravel without knowing what was happening to them, it was the most exquisite form of control. As Daniel spoke, Walsh realized just how far-reaching his manipulations had been. He wasn't just controlling his victims, he had manipulated entire communities, built his own persona, and crafted a perfect narrative. He had carefully inserted himself into people's lives, offering help and sympathy, making them trust him, and then, at the right moment, he pulled the rug out from under them. But there was something more chilling about Daniel's confession. He wasn't just admiring his past actions. He was looking forward to the future, to more victims, to a continued game of manipulation. I was planning to leave, Detective. Millstone had become too small, too predictable. But I wasn't finished yet. There were more pieces to move. He looked at her, his eyes gleaming with an unsettling mixture of admiration and derision. You're good, though. You almost figured it out. It's impressive, really. But that's the thing about people like you. You never really understand the game until you're too deep into it. But just as Walsh felt the weight of his words sinking in, something clicked in her mind. It was too easy. Too clean. Daniel was talking too freely, too openly. There was something else here. Something he wasn't telling her. Why now? Walsh asked, her voice low. Why admit it now? After all this time? Daniel paused. For the first time, there was a flicker of hesitation in his eyes. But it was brief, and it was gone as quickly as it appeared. Because, Detective, I'm not the only one playing this game. Walsh's heart skipped a beat. What do you mean? Daniel leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. I was never alone in this. You think I'm the only one pulling the strings? You're wrong. There's someone else, someone who helped me, someone who's still out there, waiting. The blood drained from Walsh's face. Everything she thought she understood had just shifted. There was a bigger force at play than just Daniel Carter. He had been a pawn in someone else's twisted game. The true mastermind, the puppet master behind the puppet master, had been watching all along. The case, which had seemed like it was finally solved, had only just begun to unravel in ways Walsh had never imagined. Is this the end of the line for Daniel Carter, or is Walsh walking straight into an even darker web of lies and manipulation? Stay tuned as the truth takes a dangerous turn. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon to get the latest updates on this shocking case. What secrets does Daniel's confession hide? Find out in the next Soon. The deeper Detective Sarah Walsh plunged into the labyrinth of lies and deceit, the more she realized how far-reaching the darkness went. Daniel Carter was just the beginning, a mere pawn in a much larger, far more dangerous game. And as the truth came crashing down, Walsh found herself racing against time to uncover the identity of the true mastermind before the entire town of Millstone was consumed by a web of chaos, control, and manipulation. The final confrontation was imminent, but would it be too late? Detective Walsh sat in her office, staring at the case file spread out before her. It was all there, the disappearances, the deaths, the manipulations, all leading back to Daniel Carter. She had thought that the pieces had finally clicked into place, but his last words still echoed in her mind. I was never alone in this. The truth, Walsh realized, was far more terrifying than she had ever imagined. Daniel had been just a tool, a puppet controlled by someone else. The man who had been behind everything, who had orchestrated every death, every disappearance, every lie, was still out there. And now, Walsh was more determined than ever to bring the true mastermind to light. Her team had been combing through the evidence, but every lead seemed to hit a dead end. Then, an unexpected break came. While reviewing Daniel's phone records, Walsh noticed something peculiar. In the weeks leading up to Olivia's disappearance, Daniel had been in constant contact with someone who had seemed unimportant, a name that hadn't stood out at first glance. But as Walsh traced the connection, she began to understand just how significant it was. The person on the other end of the line was none other than Dr. Richard Hayes, a well-known psychiatrist from a nearby city. Dr. Hayes had been in the business of psychological manipulation for decades, specializing in treating trauma victims. But Walsh knew that there was something off about him. His patients often spoke of his ability to fix them in unsettlingly quick and sometimes bizarre ways. There were rumors that his methods had crossed ethical lines, but no one had ever been able to prove it. Now, Walsh realized Dr. Hayes wasn't just treating victims, he was creating them. He had been the true mastermind behind the manipulations, and Daniel Carter was merely his puppet, carrying out his twisted plans. Dr. Hayes had been experimenting with human minds for years, manipulating those around him to see if he could push them to the edge. But he wasn't satisfied with just creating small-scale manipulations. He wanted control on a grander scale, and that's where Daniel came in. Through years of psychological study, Hayes had honed the ability to control people from afar, to implant suggestions and ideas that would stay with them, controlling their thoughts and actions without them even realizing it. Daniel, it seemed, had been the perfect candidate. A man with a troubled past, someone who had always felt out of control, Hayes had exploited that vulnerability. He'd manipulated Daniel into becoming his tool, using him to plant ideas, gaslight people, and create chaos in Millstone. Olivia had been close to discovering the truth, which is why she had to be silenced. Nathaniel had been another loose end. Hayes had been manipulating Daniel for months, if not longer. Daniel didn't even realize the full extent of Hayes' control over him, until now. In their final conversation, Daniel had admitted to Walsh that there was someone else pulling the strings, but it was more than just a confession. It was the moment Daniel had realized he had been a pawn all along. And now, Dr. Hayes had become the key to unraveling everything. Walsh needed to confront Dr. Hayes. She had no time to waste. She gathered her team and moved quickly, heading to Dr. Hayes' clinic. She knew this would be dangerous. Hayes had been hiding in plain sight for years, and if he realized she was onto him, he wouldn't hesitate to flee, or worse. The clinic sat on the edge of town, an imposing, almost sterile building surrounded by dense trees. Walsh approached cautiously, her heart pounding. She knew that Hayes wasn't just a criminal, he was a master of the mind, someone who had carefully constructed a life of control. He would never go down without a fight. When she entered, Hayes greeted her with an unnervingly calm smile. "Detective Walsh, I've been expecting you," he said, as if he had known all along this moment would come. "Please, sit. Let's talk about what's really going on here." Walsh's gut twisted as she sat across from him. She could feel his presence, his power. But she wasn't afraid. She had come too far to turn back now. "You've been controlling him, haven't you?" Walsh said, her voice steady but full of conviction. "Daniel Carter is just a tool you've been using to manipulate everyone in this town. And it's all been leading back to you." Hayes didn't flinch. "It's not that simple, Detective. You see, people like Daniel are malleable. They're vulnerable. They don't realize how easy it is to push them in the right direction, to make them do things they never thought possible." He leaned forward, his smile widening. "I've been helping people. Fixing them. Making them better. The things I do, this town, the chaos, it's all part of the greater plan. You can't stop what's already set in motion. And Daniel, he's the key. He always was." Walsh's mind raced. She had to get to him before he escaped again, before he continued his work. She needed to end this. As Walsh reached for her radio to call for backup, Hayes' demeanor shifted. His eyes darkened, and a wicked grin crossed his face. "You're too late," he said, his voice now a low whisper. "This isn't just about Daniel. It's about control. You don't understand the power I have, what I can do to people. I've made them all see things, feel things, believe things they never thought possible. And soon, you'll see it too." Before Walsh could react, Hayes lunged forward, but she was ready. She grabbed his wrist and twisted it, forcing him down onto the ground. It was over. The pieces were finally falling into place. The mastermind has been caught. But at what cost? The truth behind Daniel Carter's manipulations and the darkness that had gripped Millstone is finally exposed. But what does it mean for the future? Stay tuned for the shocking conclusion. Don't forget to subscribe and comment below. What did you think of Dr. Hayes' confession? The case had been solved. Daniel Carter and Dr. Richard Hayes were arrested, their manipulations exposed for the world to see. But even as the dust settled, the town of Millstone would never be the same. Detective Sarah Walsh had uncovered the darkest secrets of the town, but in doing so, she had unleashed a truth that no one could undo. The psychological scars left on the victims, the families, and even herself would last far longer than any arrest or confession ever could. The months following the arrests of Daniel Carter and Dr. Richard Hayes were filled with both relief and an overwhelming sense of dread. The town of Millstone, which had once been a place of sleepy tranquility, was now a community tainted by the horrific crimes that had been hidden in plain sight for so long. Walsh's role in the investigation was hailed as a triumph, but the emotional toll weighed heavily on her. There was no victory in the outcome, just a painful acknowledgement of the cost. Walsh sat at her desk, her fingers idly tapping against the wooden surface as she stared at the case file. She had done her job. The perpetrators were behind bars. The town could begin to yield. But what had she really accomplished? Yes, she had exposed the truth, but the damage had already been done. People were gone. Lives had been destroyed in ways that could never be fully repaired. The families of Olivia, Nathaniel, and the other victims had been left to pick up the pieces, their grief compounded by the realization that they had been manipulated for so long by someone who had been right under their noses. Olivia's mother, Caroline, had struggled to come to terms with the fact that her daughter had been silenced in such a cold, calculated manner. The guilt that haunted her weighed heavily on Walsh, who had spent countless hours trying to provide answers, but never truly feeling that she had brought peace. Despite her outward appearance of control, Walsh herself had been deeply affected by the case. The psychological manipulation that Daniel and Hayes had wielded against their victims wasn't just about physical harm, it was about control. The ability to bend someone's will, to make them question their own reality, had left Walsh grappling with her own sense of trust. Had she missed something along the way? Had she been manipulated in ways she couldn't even understand? The darkest part of this case wasn't the murders. It was the fact that the true evil hadn't been a single person. It had been the system of control, the manipulation of human minds. Daniel had been nothing more than a puppet, as Hayes had stated, and that truth haunted Walsh more than anything else. She wasn't just fighting to bring a criminal to justice, she was battling the very nature of control itself. She had lost a part of herself in this case. And that, in many ways, was the greatest price she had paid. Millstone had changed. The people who once knew each other's names in passing now looked at each other with suspicion, wondering who was hiding their own dark secrets. The sense of community, the trust that had once defined this town, had been shattered. No one could walk the streets the same way again. Dr. Richard Hayes' clinic had been shut down, but the damage he had done to his patients, people who had sought help, not knowing they were being manipulated, could never be undone. The victims of his psychological games were left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives. Many would never fully recover, haunted by the things they had been made to believe, the actions they had been forced to commit. For Walsh, the case was more than just solving a crime, it was a journey into the darkest parts of human nature. She had uncovered the ability of one man to bend others to his will, to manipulate and control them with nothing more than words and ideas. The psychological damage had been far more profound than anything she had anticipated. But in the aftermath, Walsh couldn't shake the feeling that there was something even darker lurking just beneath the surface. Hayes had admitted that he wasn't alone in his manipulations. Daniel had been his puppet, yes, but who else had been watching? Who else had learned from Hayes's methods? The town, once peaceful, now seemed like a place where anything could happen, and no one would ever know the full extent of the control that had been wielded. As the months passed, Walsh began to ask herself questions she hadn't dared to entertain before. How many more were out there like Hayes? How many other masters were hiding in plain sight, manipulating others without anyone realizing it? The psychological grip he had left on Millstone was like a poison, slowly infecting the minds of everyone who had been involved. What would it take to truly heal? For Walsh, the question wasn't about the resolution of the case, it was about the aftermath. There was no true closure in this investigation. The scars ran deep, not just for the victims but for the entire town. And for Walsh herself, the weight of what she had uncovered would never be fully lifted. The case is closed, but the echoes of the truth will last forever. What will the people of Millstone do now that the full extent of the manipulation has been revealed? Can they rebuild? Can Detective Walsh ever escape the emotional toll of this case? Subscribe for more investigations into the dark recesses of the human mind, and share your thoughts in the comments below. This story may be over, but the questions will remain.